At 70, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was illness. I was wrong. The real danger was sitting beside my hospital bed, calling me Mom. I had spent my life thinking I understood the world, thinking I knew the people closest to me. I raised 3 children, nurtured them through scraped knees, heartbreaks, graduations, and weddings. I had survived a marriage that ended quietly, and yet, I had believed that love and effort meant safety. At 70, I believed my struggles were behind me. I believed my children loved me. That belief followed me into Dr. Miller's office on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the clouds hang low and the city smells faintly of rain and car exhaust. Michael sat beside me, scrolling through his phone, tapping the screen impatiently. Laura, my daughter-in-law, kept adjusting my scarf as if I were incapable of doing it myself. "You okay, Mom?" Michael asked without looking up. "I'm fine," I said, smiling, because I always smiled. It made things easier, for me, for them. The nurse called my name, and Michael stood immediately. "I'll come with her," he said. Laura nodded and followed. Dr. Andrew Miller, my doctor for nearly 10 years, entered with his usual calm smile, but his posture was stiff, almost hesitant. "Could I speak with Evelyn alone for a moment?" he asked. Michael frowned. "She gets confused sometimes," Laura interjected. "It's better if one of us stays." "I'm not confused," I said sharply. I was not. Something in his tone warned me that this conversation was unlike any other I had with him. Once the door clicked shut behind my children, Dr. Miller leaned forward. "Evelyn, I'm telling you this because ethically, I must. And because I believe you deserve to know." I nodded slowly. "About what?" "Your family," he said carefully, "has asked me to evaluate your mental competence." I laughed. "Oh, that's silly. Michael worries too much. Forgetting names, a misplaced checkbook, nothing serious." Dr. Miller shook his head. "They're planning more than that. They're exploring legal guardianship, possibly involuntary placement in a nursing facility." I felt my chest tighten. "For my own safety?" He hesitated. "For control. Control of your assets, your property, your finances." I couldn't breathe. The woman who had raised children, run a household, managed her life with care, was being framed as incompetent by the very people I trusted the most. They've been lying, forging signatures, redirecting mail. "They're building a narrative to convince authorities you cannot manage your own affairs," he said quietly. I sat in stunned silence. Every memory of love, every act of trust, suddenly twisted. Michael, who had hugged me so often, Rachel, who called me Mom, Laura, Daniel. They weren't just my children anymore. They were strangers in my own home. When the door opened behind me, Laura peeked in, her smile bright. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Everything's fine." That night, lying in my bed, I stared at the ceiling fan, counting each rotation as if it could help me organize my thoughts. The words from Dr. Miller repeated in my mind, echoing louder than any storm outside. Michael insisting on handling my bills. Rachel rolling her eyes at questions. Daniel avoiding eye contact whenever money came up. I realized I had mistaken silence for respect, obedience for care, and efficiency for concern. I reached under my bed and pulled out the small, hidden folder marked private, containing decades of careful documents. Property deeds, trust papers, and investment statements. They knew about some of it, but most they had never suspected. And they never would, not unless I allowed them. The next morning, I locked my bedroom door. I made a call to Jonathan Reed, a lawyer recommended discreetly by a friend I trusted. "I need help," I said quietly. Quietly. "My family is planning to take everything I have." "You've come to the right place," Jonathan replied calmly. I hung up, feeling an unfamiliar thrill. At 70, I was about to fight my own children. Not with shouting or tears, but with patience, strategy, and the law. For the next few days I observed them. Every glance, every slight misplacement of papers, every whispered conversation was recorded in my mind. They were arrogant in their assumptions, confident in their control. Michael tried to take my checkbook once, Rachel lingered too long near my desk, Daniel accessed my computer surreptitiously. Each act was a thread in a web they thought invisible, but I was watching. Late one night, I placed a small digital recorder on my nightstand. When voices crept through the quiet house, I let it capture everything. Michael's voice, cold and calculating. By the time she realizes, it'll be done. Laura whispered, giggling softly. She suspects nothing. Rachel stood in the hallway, silent but present. I lay in bed, a quiet observer of my own life unraveling before me. And as I listened, clarity washed over me. They had underestimated me. They had forgotten the woman who raised them, the woman who had survived everything life threw at her. I didn't react. Not yet. I would wait. I would watch. And when the time came, I would strike. By the end of that week, I had taken my first steps in preparation. Reviewing every account, every property, arranging secure backups of documents, and quietly lining up legal protection. The house was theirs in appearance only. The real control, my control, was quietly shifting into my hands. I whispered to myself as I had so many times before, "You wanted control. You should have asked." The next morning, the house felt heavier. Every glance I cast, every word I spoke was measured. Michael hovered near the mail again, pretending casual interest, while Rachel sorted bills with deliberate carelessness, and Laura hovered near the counter, her movements too precise, almost rehearsed. Daniel stayed silent, but I caught him glancing at the computer screen too often to be innocent. I moved as though unaware, making breakfast, pouring coffee, tidying up. Every gesture was calculated, practiced in patience and quiet observation. I let them speak freely, assuming their control over my life, not interfering, not questioning, because the most dangerous enemy is the one who underestimates you. Mid-morning, I made my first trip to the bank alone. The young teller greeted me with a polite smile, unaware of the tension under the calm exterior I wore like armor. I asked for a full account summary. My stomach tightened as I read the details. Withdrawals I never authorized, transfers I hadn't approved, a power of attorney document dated several weeks prior. Signed in my name. I traced each line carefully, my fingers steady over the papers. They had been careful, deliberate, calculating. Each transaction a small step toward control. They had assumed I would not notice, that age had dulled my awareness, that love made me blind. They were wrong. Returning home, I saw Michael in the living room, casually flipping through a magazine, pretending normalcy. I smiled politely, as though nothing had occurred. "Lovely day," I said, though my mind was far from casual pleasantries. He looked up, startled for a fraction of a second. "Yes, it's sunny," he said. I moved through the house quietly, observing reactions, noting inconsistencies. Rachel left her phone out carelessly, and I captured a few messages for later review. Daniel lingered near the doorway, pretending to water the plants, but his nervous energy betrayed him. Laura spoke softly, mentioning a doctor's appointment I hadn't scheduled, as though she had some right to decide. That evening, I placed the small recorder on the nightstand, hidden from sight. I had learned from Dr. Miller that careful, discreet evidence could be decisive. I lay in bed, pretending to read, while they whispered in the dark corners of my house, confident I was asleep, unaware of the careful ear monitoring their every word. Michael's voice was first. "She's been noticing things, but she won't act quickly." Laura laughed softly. "She suspects nothing. By the time she realizes, we'll have everything ready." Rachel's tone was tense, careful, sharp. "The doctor is handling it. She's not going to interfere." I lay still, letting their words settle, committing each syllable to memory. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected, not because I had been unaware, but because the people I loved, the people I nurtured, had built a plan to deceive me. Over the next few days, I moved with quiet precision. Every time Michael reached for a bill or tried to control my checkbook, I allowed him access briefly, noting every number, every transaction. I checked accounts, compared statements, recorded anomalies. Each subtle shift, every whisper and glance, was a thread weaving a clear picture of intent. I returned home one afternoon to find Rachel lingering near the desk, her fingers hovering over papers I valued. I smiled gently. "Looking for something?" "Oh, I was just organizing," she said, flustered, trying to appear casual. I nodded, pretending not to notice the tension in her shoulders. They thought they controlled the environment, but every action fed me information, evidence for the moment I would reclaim my life. That night, I reviewed the recordings, listening for tone, inflection, hidden meanings. Michael's voice was precise, confident, Laura's calculated, careful, Rachel's defensive, reactive, Daniel silent but complicit. They had practiced their deception well, but no plan survives contact with reality. And reality in this house was finally awake. I called Jonathan Reed quietly, arranging consultations under the guise of routine questions, ensuring my lawyer was informed, ready for the actions that would follow. Every document, every account, every whisper was backed up, protected. I was preparing, not reacting. By the end of the week, I had established a system. Observe, record, catalog, and protect. They believed themselves in control, believing that age had dulled my faculties, that love had blinded me. In truth, I had sharpened my mind, honed my awareness, and prepared the first moves in a game they had no idea I had already started. I whispered to myself as I turned off the lights that night. You assumed weakness. You assumed compliance. You were wrong. The house was quiet, but in the silence, I felt a growing power, patient, deliberate, unstoppable. I stopped pretending after that week, but only inside my head. On the outside, I became softer, slower, exactly the version of me they expected. I misplaced words on purpose. I asked the same question twice. I let my hands shake slightly when signing grocery receipts. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to feed their confidence. Confidence makes people careless. Michael began taking phone calls in the kitchen instead of outside. Rachel stopped locking her laptop. Laura started speaking about my future care openly, as if the decision had already been made. Daniel avoided eye contact altogether, which told me more than his words ever could. They thought the hunt was over. I began waking before dawn. The house was quiet at that hour, a different kind of silence. Honest, unguarded. I brewed my coffee slowly and sat at the dining table with my notebook hidden inside an old Bible they never touched. Page after page, I wrote dates, times, fragments of conversations, transaction numbers, names. I wrote until my fingers cramped. Memory fades. Ink doesn't. One morning, I overheard Rachel on the phone while pretending to nap in the living room. She's declining faster than we thought, she said casually. No aggression. Just confusion. The doctor agrees. The doctor. My chest tightened, but I stayed still, my breathing shallow and uneven, like sleep. When she hung up, I opened my eyes just slightly and saw her looking at me. Not with love, not with concern, but with calculation. That look haunted me all day. By noon, I drove to the medical office alone. I didn't announce it. I didn't ask permission. I simply went. Dr. Henson's receptionist hesitated when she saw me. "Oh, you're early," she said. "For my own life?" I replied calmly. "No. I'm late." Dr. Henson avoided my eyes during the appointment. His hands moved too fast, his answers rehearsed. When I asked about the cognitive assessment he'd allegedly completed, he shuffled papers that didn't exist. "There's been input from your family," he said carefully. "I didn't consent to that," I said. He cleared his throat. "It's common practice." "No," I said quietly. "It's not." The room felt smaller then. He tried to smile. I stood. "Any diagnosis, recommendation, or communication about my mental capacity without my informed consent is a violation," I said. "And it will be treated as such." His face drained of color. I left without waiting for a response. That afternoon, I met Jonathan Reed in person for the first time. He was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, composed. He didn't interrupt once as I spoke. He let me talk. He listened. When I finished, he closed the folder slowly. "You're not imagining this," he said. "And you're not powerless." I exhaled for the first time in days. We began restructuring quietly. New accounts. New authorizations. A trust amendment they didn't know existed. Properties transferred into entities with layers they couldn't penetrate. Every move legal. Every move invisible. The wealth I'd built over decades, investments, real estate, inheritances I'd never discussed, was no longer exposed. They had been circling a shadow, unaware of how much ground I still owned. At home, the atmosphere shifted. Michael grew impatient. "You forgot to sign the insurance forms," he snapped one evening. "I don't remember seeing them," I replied gently. Rachel sighed dramatically. "That's exactly what we're worried about." I smiled. Worried is such a heavy word. They exchanged glances. Later that night, I left the recorder on the kitchen counter instead of hiding it. I wanted to see how bold they'd become. Bold enough, it turned out. "She's stalling," Laura said. "We need to move faster." Michael's voice was sharper now. "The paperwork is ready. The evaluation is all we need." Daniel finally spoke. "What if she fights it?" Rachel laughed. "She won't. She doesn't even know." I listened from the hallway, my heart steady, my resolve unshaken. They were wrong about one thing, no, about everything. The next morning, I let myself cry at the breakfast table. Not real tears. Controlled ones. Enough to unsettle them. "I'm scared," I said softly. "I don't feel clear anymore." Laura reached for my hand too quickly. "That's okay, Mom. We're here." I squeezed her fingers. "I'm glad," I whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The relief on her face made me sick. By the end of the week, they scheduled a family meeting. I agreed immediately. Too quickly. That made them comfortable. Comfort breeds mistakes. The night before the meeting, I sat alone in my room, surrounded by files they had never seen. Audio recordings labeled by date. Bank statements. Emails. Messages. Signed affidavits. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building a case. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Older, yes, but not broken. Tired, but not defeated. I had raised children, buried a husband, survived loss and illness and decades of compromise. They thought 70 meant finished. They forgot who taught them how to survive. Downstairs, laughter drifted up the stairs. They were celebrating early. I turned off the light and lay back, calm as a woman who knows exactly when the trap will close. And this time, I would not be the one inside it. The morning light spilled across the kitchen, soft and warm, but I noticed nothing except the tension in the air. Michael shuffled papers as if the house itself could absorb his anxiety. Rachel hummed softly, a tune she thought casual, but her voice trembled whenever she mentioned my finances. Laura hovered near the sink, scrubbing a pan that had already been clean, and Daniel leaned against the doorway, pretending to read a magazine but listening anyway. Every small action carried the weight of conspiracy. I poured coffee slowly, inhaling the rich aroma, pretending to savor it. "Would anyone like some?" I asked lightly, keeping my tone cheerful, almost maternal. Michael shook his head, Rachel waved her hand. Laura's eyes met mine briefly, searching for the weakness she believed existed. Daniel's silence was a confirmation. He was watching, calculating. I drank in the scene calmly, noting every detail. Their movements were too practiced, their words carefully chosen. They thought they were clever. They were only careless. Confidence and overestimation always betray the guilty. After breakfast, I went to my office, a quiet room at the end of the hall I had converted into my personal command center. Here, I had files stacked by date, folders labeled meticulously, transactions, conversations, suspicious activity. I began reviewing the latest information I had gathered, cross-referencing deposits, withdrawals, transfers, and irregularities. A pattern emerged. They had been testing boundaries, probing to see how much they could manipulate, assuming that subtlety would shield them. But every move had left a trace. An email, a note, a timestamp, a fleeting glance. And I had observed them all. Later, Rachel attempted to corner me in the living room. "Mom," she said softly, "we just want to help. You've been making so many mistakes lately." I looked at her calmly, letting the words settle into the empty space between us. Help? By making decisions for me? By moving money without my consent? Her face faltered. She opened her mouth but closed it again, searching for a lie that would sound plausible. I continued, "I've noticed every transaction, every unexplained withdrawal, every alteration of my documents. I have records. I have witnesses. And I will not be manipulated." Michael entered then, pretending to straighten a chair. "Evelyn, you're overreacting. You know we only want what's best for you." I smiled faintly. If I were overreacting, would I have proof? Laura's eyes widened. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. For a fleeting moment, I saw the fear I had been waiting for, the first crack in their armor. That evening, I recorded yet another conversation. This time, I left the recorder in plain view, a subtle trap. Michael, oblivious, discussed finalizing the paperwork with Laura, while Rachel whispered about timing and urgency. Daniel nodded silently. The silence of complicity. Every word was captured, time-stamped, and secured. After they went to bed, I returned to my office. I spread the documents across my desk and allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. They had underestimated me, and their hubris was evident in every line, every movement, every whisper. I thought back to Dr. Miller's warning, the first moment I realized my family could betray me. Now I had moved beyond shock and fear into control. I knew what they were capable of, and I knew how to counter it. Patience, observation, and preparation had become my tools. The following day, I allowed them to continue their daily routines while I discreetly monitored every interaction. I made minor adjustments to my accounts, changes so subtle that Michael noticed only after hours, when the delay began to frustrate him. I called my lawyer Jonathan, with detailed updates and planned the next stage. Legal documentation, secure storage of evidence, and gradual exposure of their schemes. That night, I confronted the reality of my situation in the quiet of my bedroom. I had spent 70 years raising a family, teaching them values, showing love, trusting them to respect me. And yet, here I was, planning defenses against the people I loved most. The pain was acute but tempered by clarity. I realized that love, though powerful, is never sufficient protection against greed, envy, or arrogance. I picked up the first folder of recordings and listened to their voices once more. Michael's tone was sharp, condescending. Rachel's hesitant but manipulative. Laura's calculated and sly. Daniel's silent complicity. Each voice told a story of intent, revealing patterns I could use to dismantle their plans methodically. By dawn, I had already begun the next steps. I secured my most valuable assets, updated passwords, verified property titles, and prepared legal notices that would protect me in case they tried to act while I slept. Every decision was deliberate, every move a calculated measure to reclaim control without revealing my full strength. The house was quiet now, but it was no longer theirs. They moved freely, thinking they were in command, while I observed, waited, and prepared the moment when the truth would strike. And for the first time since the hospital visit, I felt the surge of empowerment. Not anger. Not fear. Empowerment. Because in that quiet, I realized I had something they would never have. Awareness, patience, and the law on my side. I whispered to myself as I had so many nights before. You thought you could take from me. You have no idea who you're dealing with. And in that whisper, I made a silent promise. Every betrayal would be answered, every plan reversed, and every ounce of deceit exposed. The first moves were complete, but the game had only just begun. The family meeting was set for Sunday afternoon, which told me everything I needed to know. Sunday meant lawyers were harder to reach, offices were closed, and emotions were expected to run high. They wanted pressure, confusion, tears. They wanted me pliable. I agreed without hesitation. That alone should have warned them. All week, I played my role carefully. I asked Michael the same question twice about the electricity bill. I misplaced my glasses, then found them exactly where I had left them. I laughed a little too late at Rachel's jokes. Laura watched me closely, her eyes sharp, calculating, as if she were assessing how much longer the act would last. Daniel avoided me entirely. Guilt makes cowards of people who already lack courage. On Friday evening, I overheard them again. This time I didn't hide. I sat in my bedroom with the door slightly open, letting their voices drift up the hallway. She agreed way too fast, Michael said. That's because she's tired, Rachel replied. Confused people get relieved when decisions are made for them. Laura hesitated. Or she's pretending. There was a pause. My heart slowed. This was the moment. Michael scoffed. You're overthinking it. She barely remembers what day it is. I smiled to myself. Saturday morning. I drove alone again. Not to a bank this time. Not to a lawyer's office. I drove to the courthouse. The building stood tall and indifferent, a structure that had seen lies crumble and truth survive for decades. I requested certified copies, filed notices, and signed documents that quietly shifted power away from the people waiting at home. By the time I returned, the trap they were setting no longer had teeth. Rachel was waiting by the window. Where did you go? She asked too quickly. Out, I said simply. Fresh air helps me think. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. That evening, Laura brought out old photo albums. Childhood memories. Holidays. Birthdays. A performance designed to soften me, to remind me of love so I would forget betrayal. I played along, touching the pictures slowly, my fingers lingering on moments I had believed were proof of family. I did my best, I said quietly. You did more than enough, Mom, Laura replied, squeezing my hand. The lie was so smooth it almost impressed me. Sunday arrived with a strange calm. The house was spotless. Coffee brewed early. Everyone was overly polite, overly gentle. Michael wore his serious face. Rachel sat beside Laura, hands folded. Daniel stood near the door, as if already preparing an exit. They gathered me in the living room like an intervention. Michael spoke first. We're worried about you. I nodded. I know. Rachel leaned forward. We've noticed changes. Confusion. Forgetfulness. I forget things sometimes. I agreed. Laura reached for a folder on the table. We think it's time to consider assisted living. Somewhere safe. Comfortable. Where professionals can help, Michael added. I looked at the folder. Thick. Prepared. Signed tabs visible through the paper. Guardianship documents. Medical evaluations. Power of attorney transfers. So, I said softly, you want to take control of my life. Silence. Rachel forced a smile. We want to protect you. From what? I asked. From myself, she almost said. I saw it in her eyes. Instead, Michael cleared his throat. From making decisions that could harm you financially. I tilted my head. You mean like the withdrawals you made without my permission? Laura stiffened. What withdrawals? She asked too quickly. I stood slowly. No shaking. No confusion. Just age-earned steadiness. The transfers from my primary account, I continued calmly. The forged authorization. The medical discussions I never consented to. The emails. The recordings. Daniel's face drained of color. Rachel laughed nervously. This isn't funny, Mom. It isn't meant to be. I walked to the side table and opened a drawer they hadn't thought to check. Inside were copies. Neatly stacked. Organized. Labeled. Michael stood abruptly. What is this? Evidence, I said. Of fraud. Elder abuse. Conspiracy. Laura's voice trembled. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. You plan to erase me quietly. Rachel's composure cracked first. You're being dramatic. No, I said. I'm being precise. I handed Michael a document. He skimmed it. His confidence draining with every line. What is this? He asked. A revocation, I replied. Of every authority you thought you had. Daniel finally spoke. You went to a lawyer. Yes. When? Laura demanded. Before you finished planning my disappearance. The room erupted. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew. Rachel cried. Michael shouted. Laura pleaded. Daniel backed away, hands raised, as if surrendering without saying it. I stood in the center of it all, calm. You assumed silence meant ignorance, I said. You assumed age meant weakness. Michael slammed the folder shut. You'll regret this. I met his eyes. No. You will. The doorbell rang. Every head turned. Michael froze. Were you expecting someone? Yes, I said. Jonathan Reed stepped inside, followed by a uniformed officer and a woman with a clipboard. Adult Protective Services. Come. Professional. Alert. This is my home, I said clearly. And these are the people who attempted to take it from me. Rachel collapsed onto the couch. Laura whispered. You set us up. I shook my head. You did that yourselves. The officer began asking questions. Jonathan handed over documents. The woman with the clipboard took notes, her eyes sharp, trained to recognize patterns of abuse. Michael tried to speak. His words tangled. Lies unravel when confronted with paper and law. As they were separated into different rooms, I sat alone at the dining table, hands folded, heart steady. 70 years of living had taught me something simple and brutal. Love does not excuse betrayal, and blood does not grant ownership. Through the doorway, I heard raised voices, sobs, denials. I didn't listen. I stared instead at the sunlight streaming through the window, warm and steady, touching the floor like a promise. For the first time in months, the house felt like mine again. And this time, no one was taking it away. They were still in my house when the sun began to set, but it no longer felt like their territory. The officer's calm presence shifted everything. The living room, once filled with familiar furniture and family photos, now felt like a stage where masks had finally fallen. Michael tried to regain control first. He always did. "This is unnecessary," he said sharply, his voice tight. "We were only trying to help our mother." The officer didn't look impressed. "Then you won't mind answering a few questions separately." That word, separately, hit them harder than any accusation. Rachel's eyes darted toward Laura. Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel stepped back again, closer to the hallway, as if distance could absolve him. I watched it all from my chair, hands folded in my lap, outwardly calm, inwardly braced. I had imagined this moment so many times that when it arrived, it felt almost unreal. They took Michael first. As he stood, his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He shot me a look, anger mixed with disbelief. He had never imagined I would go this far. He thought I would cry, beg, forgive. I did none of those things. While he was questioned in the study, Rachel was left sitting across from me. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her knee bounced uncontrollably. "I didn't want it to be like this," she muttered. I turned to her slowly. "Then why was it?" She swallowed. "We were afraid." "Of what?" "That you'd spend it all. That strangers would take advantage of you. And so you decided to do it yourselves," I said quietly. Her face crumpled. "We deserved something. After everything." I studied her, the daughter I had stayed awake nights for, the child I had defended, the woman now justifying theft with entitlement. "You deserved honesty," I said. "Not my erasure." She began to cry then, real tears this time. Not because she was sorry, but because she was caught. Laura went next. She walked into the dining room with her chin lifted, rehearsed composure still intact. When the questions began, though, her confidence faltered. She contradicted herself. She blamed Michael. Then she blamed me. "She's manipulative," Laura said. "She's always been controlling." I almost laughed. Daniel was last. He barely spoke. When he did, it was in fragments. "I didn't plan it. I just went along. I thought it was temporary." Temporary theft. Temporary betrayal. Hours passed like that. Statements. Documents. Phone calls. Jonathan moved through the house like a quiet anchor, steady, precise, ensuring every word was recorded correctly. The woman from Adult Protective Services asked me questions too. Gentle but thorough. "Did you feel pressured?" she asked. "Yes." "Did they restrict your access to finances?" "Yes." "Did they discuss your mental capacity without your consent?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, writing everything down. When night fell, the officer informed them they would need to vacate the house until further notice. The shock on their faces was almost theatrical. "You can't do this," Michael protested. "I can," the officer replied calmly. "And I am." Rachel looked at me then, panic flooding her expression. "Mom, please. We have nowhere to go." I stood up. "You plan to put me somewhere without asking," I said. "You'll manage." They left one by one. No hugs. No apologies that mattered. Just slammed doors, hurried footsteps, the sound of lives unraveling. When the house finally went quiet, I sat down on the edge of the couch and let the silence wrap around me. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. The kind that comes after holding your breath too long. Jonathan sat across from me. "This is just the beginning," he said gently. "There will be hearings. Investigations." "I know," I replied. "You did everything right." I nodded, though the praise felt strange. Survival didn't feel like something that deserved applause. That night, I slept with my bedroom door locked for the first time in years. The next morning, the calls started. Extended family. Friends. Neighbors. Word traveled fast when scandal involved money and age. Some voices were sympathetic, others curious, a few judgmental. I ignored most of them. Adult Protective Services returned in the afternoon. They conducted a full assessment. Me, the house, my routines. I answered everything honestly. I passed every test they offered with quiet satisfaction. She's fully competent, the woman said later firmly. And very aware. I smiled faintly. By midweek, the legal consequences began to take shape. The fraudulent transactions were frozen. Investigations opened into the forged documents. Dr. Henson's name appeared again, this time in official letters. He called me twice. I didn't answer. Michael tried to reach me through an email. Long, defensive, angry. He claimed misunderstanding. He claimed stress. He claimed love. I deleted it. Rachel sent a message at 3 in the morning. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. I stared at the screen for a long time before locking the phone and placing it face down. Laura sent nothing. Daniel sent a single voicemail, his voice shaking. I didn't know how to stop it. I saved it. Not to forgive him. To remember. The house began to feel different after that. Lighter. Safer. I walked through rooms I hadn't truly occupied in months. I opened windows. I rearranged furniture. I reclaimed spaces they had invaded with whispers and plans. One afternoon, as I sorted through old papers, I found a photo tucked between documents. Me years ago, standing alone on a beach, hair whipping in the wind, eyes bright. I barely recognized her at first. But she was still there. That realization settled deep inside me, grounding me. They had tried to reduce me to a signature, a diagnosis, a bank account. Instead, they had reminded me of something far more dangerous. I was still capable of fighting back. And this fight was not over yet. The legal process moved slowly, but its weight was constant. Every day brought a new envelope, a new email, a new reminder that what my family had tried to do was not a misunderstanding. It was a crime unfolding in layers. Jonathan warned me early that patience would be required. Justice, he said, was thorough, not fast. I had lived 70 years. I could wait. The first hearing was scheduled for a gray Tuesday morning. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to ground myself. A simple navy suit, pearl earrings I had worn for decades, shoes worn enough to feel familiar. I wanted nothing about me to appear fragile or exaggerated. Just present. Just real. In the courthouse hallway, I saw them again. Michael sat stiffly on a wooden bench, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed ahead. Rachel clutched her purse like a shield. Laura looked smaller than I remembered. Her confidence dimmed under fluorescent lights. Daniel lingered near the wall. Alone. None of them approached me. That silence hurt more than shouting ever could. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and sterile. When my name was called, I stood without hesitation. I felt every eye on me. Judges, clerks, strangers who knew nothing of bedtime stories or scraped knees or sacrifices made quietly over decades. They only saw an elderly woman. They did not see the lifetime behind me. The evidence spoke when emotions could not. Bank records. Recorded conversations. Signed statements. Medical violations. Patterns of coercion laid out cleanly, unemotionally. Facts are ruthless that way. They leave no room for excuses. Michael's attorney tried to paint me as confused, emotional, manipulated by an overzealous lawyer. Jonathan countered with precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He let the truth speak. When it was my turn to testify, I felt a stillness settle over me. I told them everything. Not angrily. Not tearfully. Simply. I described how I had raised my children. How I had trusted them. How slowly, quietly, that trust had been used against me. I spoke about the doctor's warning, the forged documents, the whispers in my own house about my disappearance. When I finished, the room was silent. Rachel cried openly. Laura stared at the table. Michael looked furious, not at himself, but at being exposed. That was when I understood something painful and permanent. Remorse and regret are not the same. Outside the courtroom, Daniel finally approached me. His hands trembled. I didn't think it would go this far, he said. I looked at him for a long moment. That's the problem, I replied. You never think until it's too late. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I'm sorry. I did not respond. Weeks passed. The investigation widened. Dr. Henson's license was suspended pending review. The financial institution issued formal apologies and restitution. Protective orders were extended. Temporary restraining orders became permanent. Michael lost access to every account. Rachel faced charges related to fraud. Laura's professional reputation, carefully built, began to crumble under scrutiny. And through it all, I lived alone in my house for the first time in years. At first, the quiet was unsettling. I would wake in the night expecting footsteps, whispers, tension. Instead, there was only the sound of my own breathing, steady and real. I began to enjoy small freedoms I hadn't realized I'd lost. I cooked what I wanted. I watched television without commentary. I spent money without justification. I took long walks without explaining where I was going. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. Handwritten. It was from Rachel. She wrote about fear. About pressure. About resentment she didn't know how to express. She blamed Michael. She blamed Laura. She blamed stress. She blamed everything except choice. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with the others. Not as evidence this time, but as a reminder. Jonathan called later that week. They're offering a settlement, he said. For what? I asked. To avoid trial. To limit exposure. I considered it. Settlement meant closure without spectacle. It meant quiet consequences instead of public reckoning. And if I refuse? I asked. They'll have to answer for everything, he said. In full view. I looked around my living room. The house I had almost lost. The walls that had heard secrets and lies. The space that was finally mine again. I'm not hiding anymore, I said. The next hearing was harsher. More public. Reporters attended. Whispers followed me into the courtroom. This time, Michael looked smaller. Older. His certainty had evaporated. Rachel avoided cameras. Laura's composure was gone entirely. The judge spoke clearly, firmly. Elder abuse. Financial exploitation. Conspiracy. Words that echoed. Sentences were not handed down that day, but accountability was. Assets seized. Charges formalized. Reputations shattered. Afterward, as I walked down the courthouse steps, the sun broke through the clouds. I paused for a moment, letting its warmth reach my face. A reporter called out, "How does it feel to stand up to your own family?" I stopped. "It feels like survival," I said. "Not revenge." That night, I sat at my dining table with a glass of wine. Not in celebration. In acknowledgement. I had lost something irrevocable. But I had gained something else. Something I hadn't realized was missing. Myself. The phone buzzed once. A new message. From Laura. "You didn't have to destroy us." I stared at the screen for a long time before placing the phone face down. I hadn't destroyed anyone. I had simply refused to disappear. And the world, finally, had been forced to see it. The house felt different after the hearings. I walked through rooms I hadn't entered in years, noticing dust in corners I had ignored, sunlight through windows I hadn't opened, the faint scent of old wood mixed with lavender. For the first time in decades, the space felt entirely mine. Every creak of the floorboard, every echo down the hallway reminded me that I no longer had to measure my steps, my words, or my silence. Yet, the sense of ownership came with a shadow. I had uncovered their betrayal, yes, but that revelation opened the doors to secrets I had never anticipated. My children had been clever, planning for months, perhaps years, weaving schemes so intricate I had barely begun to understand the full scope. That understanding weighed on me, pressing like the heavy curtains in the living room. I sat at my desk, spreading out folders, files, and printouts. Each one was a thread in a tapestry of deception, some threads more insidious than others. I realized they had not only tried to take my money, they had tried to rewrite my history, my decisions, and my very perception of reality. Bank statements forged, bills altered, medical consultations faked, letters sent in my name, all designed to create the narrative that I was incapable, that I had lost my mind. I listened to the recordings again. Michael's calm, rehearsed tone as he spoke about the unnecessary financial adjustments. Rachel's soft, nervous explanations when he questioned her methods. Laura's meticulous attention to every detail. The slight pause before she chose a lie. Daniel's silent complicity. The hesitation in his voice. The unspoken agreement to follow along. Each voice, each tone, each hesitation revealed their intentions and their weaknesses. Late that evening, I moved to the study, lights dimmed, the city outside glowing faintly through the blinds. I pulled out a box I had hidden under the floorboards decades ago. Inside were old ledgers, investment records, legal documents, proof of wealth they had never imagined. I realized the truth. I had assets they had never found, resources untouched by their greed. They had assumed my vulnerability, my age, my family's support, made me powerless. They were wrong. I began cataloging, creating a map of every account, every property, every investment. Jonathan had helped me set up secure digital backups, but seeing it physically, in my own hands, brought a satisfaction deeper than I could describe. For decades, I had managed finances quietly, often without anyone else knowing. It was time to use that knowledge strategically. The next morning, I staged small tests. Michael came into the kitchen, pretending casual interest in my day. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked, carefully neutral. "Better than ever," I replied, letting the words settle, calm and measured. "And you? Any new plans?" He hesitated, trying to read me. "Nothing important," he said. "Good," I said, pouring coffee. "I wouldn't want you to overexert yourself." His eyes flickered, catching a hint of the realization that I had changed. The woman they thought compliant was no longer blind or naive. Rachel lingered nearby, pretending to organize paperwork. I watched, noting which folder she glanced at, how her hands trembled slightly when she reached for a pen. Laura walked past, humming softly, a careful attempt to mask tension. Daniel lingered near the hallway, silently observing, avoiding eye contact. By mid-afternoon, I had documented every movement, every glance, every hesitation, every micro-expression. They were predictable, and predictability can be used like a weapon. Late that evening, I sat in the living room with my laptop open. I sent emails to banks, investment firms, and legal contacts, quietly securing my assets, transferring sensitive holdings into accounts they could not access. Each move was deliberate, measured, calculated to avoid detection until the right moment. As I worked, I reflected on the lessons the past months had taught me. Betrayal doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in whispers, in convenience, in assumption. It comes from people who believe love or habit shields them from accountability. I had seen it firsthand, and I had survived it. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, I answered. "Mrs. Evelyn Hopper?" a man's voice said. Professional. Precise. "I'm calling from one of the investment firms handling your assets. We've noticed irregular activity, some of it unauthorized, and we believe someone may have attempted to manipulate your accounts." I smiled faintly, a slow, deliberate smile. "Thank you for calling. That would make sense, considering the people I've had to protect myself from." There was a pause. "Do you wish to proceed with an official review?" "Yes," I replied. "Please. I want everything examined thoroughly." I hung up and leaned back, letting the chair support my weight. The house was quiet, but not as before. There was a tension, not fear, but the sense of imminent revelation. Every deception, every whispered plan, every assumption of weakness was about to be tested in a world beyond my walls. I moved through the house one more time that night, inspecting each room, each corner. Their fingerprints, metaphorical and literal, lingered in every space they had tried to claim. And yet, in every shadow, in every quiet space, I felt strength. The strength of someone who had been underestimated, someone who had survived decades of love, betrayal, and silence, and had emerged not broken, but vigilant. I whispered to myself, softly but with conviction, "They thought they could take my life, my home, my mind. They were wrong. And they will see the truth." In the kitchen, I poured a second cup of coffee. I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. Beyond the glass, the world moved unaware of the storm I had quietly prepared. Within it, I was ready, strong, deliberate, and patient. The game was no longer about survival. It was about exposing every lie, reclaiming every inch of what was mine, and ensuring that no betrayal, no matter how close to my heart, would ever go unanswered. Tomorrow I decided I would take the next step. The traps were set, the evidence catalogued, and the first cracks had already begun to show. For the first time in a long time, I felt the quiet thrill of control, and I welcomed it fully. The investigation changed everything, not all at once, but in slow grinding motions that wore people down. I learned quickly that guilt rarely collapses dramatically. It leaks. It stains. It spreads until there is nowhere left to stand without being marked by it. The calls began early one morning. First from Jonathan. His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. "We've uncovered more than we expected," he said. "Much more." I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight barely creeping through the curtains. "How much more?" I asked. "A second set of accounts," he replied. "Opened using your identity. Small amounts at first. Then larger transfers. Some routed through shell entities." I closed my eyes slowly. They hadn't just planned to take my future. They had been siphoning my past. Jonathan continued, "It appears Michael coordinated most of it, but Rachel handled logistics. Laura drafted communications. Daniel facilitated access." Each name landed like a stone, heavy but no longer shocking. Betrayal, once fully exposed, loses its ability to wound sharply. It becomes something colder. Something manageable. By midday, 2 federal investigators arrived. Polite. Thorough. Unemotional. They asked me to recount everything again, this time with more precision. Dates, amounts, conversations. I answered patiently, drawing from notes I had kept long before anyone believed I needed protecting. One of them paused halfway through. "You documented this while it was happening?" "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you leave sooner?" I looked at him carefully. "Because leaving without proof only makes you look unstable." He nodded. He understood. That afternoon, the search warrants were executed. I wasn't present, but I heard about it later. Michael's office computer seized, Laura's phone confiscated, Rachel's laptop taken straight from her apartment. Storage units. Safety deposit boxes. Documents they thought were buried forever brought into fluorescent light. Rachel called me that evening. Her voice was frantic, unrecognizable. "They came to my place," she said. "They took everything. You didn't have to let it go this far." "I didn't let anything happen," I replied calmly. "I told the truth." She sobbed. "We're your children." "Yes," I said quietly. "That's why this hurts. Not why it's excusable." She hung up without saying goodbye. The next call came from Daniel, late at night. He didn't cry. He sounded hollow. "They're offering me a deal," he said. "If I cooperate." "That's your decision," I replied. "I never wanted this," he said weakly. "No one ever wants consequences," I answered. "They arrive anyway." When I hung up, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, but clarity. The fog that had surrounded my life for months was gone. Everything was sharp now. Painful, yes, but honest. The media picked up the story within days. Headlines were careful at first, then sharper. Elder financial exploitation case expands. Family accused in coordinated fraud scheme. Photos surfaced. My house, my children leaving courthouses, Michael shielding his face from cameras. A reporter requested an interview. Jonathan advised against it. I declined. I had said everything that mattered under oath. Friends reached out, some apologetic, some ashamed they hadn't noticed. A few admitted they had believed my children when concerns about my confusion circulated. I listened without anger. Manipulation works because people want simple explanations. It had worked on them too. One evening, I received a certified letter. It was from Michael. Not an email. Not a call. Paper. Formal. Controlled. He wrote about pressure. About financial strain. About how he thought he was protecting the family. He accused me, indirectly, of favoritism, of emotional distance, of withholding support. He never apologized. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the box with the others. Not for evidence. For history. The preliminary charges were announced the following week. Conspiracy. Identity theft. Elder abuse. Financial exploitation. Hearing the words spoken aloud on the evening news felt surreal. These weren't abstract crimes. They were bedtime stories turned inside out. Holiday dinners corrupted. Trust weaponized. Laura attempted to speak to me once. She showed up at the gate, unannounced, hair pulled back tightly, eyes hollow. I stood inside, watching through the glass before opening the door. "I just want to explain," she said. "Explanations are for before," I replied. "I was trying to manage chaos," she insisted. "Someone had to be in control. And you chose yourself," I said. Her lips trembled. "You taught us to survive." "I taught you to be honest," I corrected. She left without another word. As the weeks passed, I focused on rebuilding. Not finances, those were already secure, but myself. I returned to routines I had abandoned. Morning walks. Books I had meant to read. Meals eaten slowly, without tension. I redecorated the living room. Removed furniture heavy with memory. Painted the walls a lighter color. Opened space where silence could breathe. One afternoon, Jonathan visited with updated filings. He paused before leaving. "You know," he said, "many people in your position choose to disappear. You didn't." "I couldn't," I replied. "They would have rewritten me." He nodded thoughtfully. That night, I stood alone in the kitchen, washing a single glass. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent and alive. Inside, my life, what remained of it, was finally aligned with the truth. They had believed my age made me invisible. Instead, it had made me precise. The unraveling was nearly complete now. Trials loomed. Sentences awaited. Relationships lay in ruins, some beyond repair. I didn't celebrate that. But I didn't mourn it either. Because what they tried to steal was more than money or property or authority. They tried to steal my voice. And it was the one thing I had reclaimed fully. Soon, the world would hear the rest. The weeks following the unraveling of their schemes were unlike anything I had experienced in decades. The house, once heavy with tension and the quiet manipulation of my own family, had begun to breathe. I moved through rooms with deliberate care, noticing small details I had ignored in the rush of daily life, the stress of betrayal, and the constant calculations to protect myself. The curtains, the worn rugs, the chipped edges of the dining table. Everything felt alive again, free from the shadows that had crept in unnoticed for so long. Yet, even as I walked freely through the spaces I had once called mine, I could not shake the sense of vigilance. The betrayal had left marks beyond finances. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned. I understood that completely. Every creak of the floorboard reminded me of steps taken in secret. Every faint echo of a voice reminded me of whispers I had overheard when they plotted against me. My family's audacity was staggering. They had believed their plots could be hidden in plain sight, that my age and supposed frailty made me pliable. I began documenting everything again. This time, not just their deceit, but my own reflections, the emotions, the moments of doubt, and the flashes of realization that had built my resolve. My journal became a testament not only to survival but to the reclamation of self, detailing the weeks of preparation, observation, and careful planning that had culminated in the court hearings. Each entry reminded me that I had been underestimated, but I had outwitted them without a single reckless move. One afternoon, I decided to revisit the files I had once hidden under the floorboards, the old ledgers and documents of accounts no one had ever known about. My hands ran over each folder carefully, pulling out old stock certificates, property deeds, and bank statements, the paper crisp despite the years. The realization struck me with a quiet power. Decades of careful management and quiet accumulation had left me far wealthier than anyone, even my family, had imagined. These were resources they could never reach, treasures that remained firmly in my control. I called Jonathan and spoke at length about securing additional accounts, creating trusts, and diversifying assets to ensure they were legally untouchable. Every conversation was meticulous. Every instruction precise. I no longer had to act cautiously out of fear. They were contained, and I was free. The law, combined with my foresight, had finally tipped the scales. Even as I fortified my finances, I began reclaiming the emotional space they had tried to dominate. Small rituals, once neglected, became significant. I brewed tea without asking anyone for permission, walked through the garden planting flowers I liked, and spent hours reading letters I had written decades ago. Each action, mundane as it seemed, felt revolutionary. I was creating a life on my own terms. A life no one could intrude upon. Then came the unexpected twist. Jonathan informed me that new evidence had surfaced. Emails from Laura and Michael discussing assets they thought had been hidden from me. They had believed they had carefully monitored my every move, but they hadn't anticipated the extent of my foresight. The emails revealed plans to liquidate investments, to forge documents, and to manipulate accounts they assumed I would never question. I read each email with a growing sense of validation and shock. They had never understood me. They had assumed compliance, silence, and age equated to weakness. They were wrong in ways that I had barely imagined. The audacity of their greed was staggering, but more than that, the recklessness was proof of their underestimation. Every word, every plan, every calculated deception became another layer of evidence against them. I began compiling the material for the court once more. This time, not just to protect my assets, but to expose the full scope of manipulation, to ensure accountability, and to prevent any further attempts at control. Each file I prepared, each transcript I organized, reinforced my resolve. Justice, I realized, was not a sudden stroke. It was a patient, deliberate accumulation of truth, of facts, of unwavering documentation. Meanwhile, my children's reactions varied. Michael was silent and defensive, Rachel oscillated between fear and anger, Laura attempted to negotiate behind the scenes, and Daniel seemed lost, unsure how to navigate the consequences he had indirectly supported. Their confidence, once so rigid, had crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. I observed them from the periphery, understanding their psychology, and noting the cracks in their carefully constructed facades. I spent evenings in the study, writing notes, cataloging evidence, and reflecting on every encounter. The quiet of the house, the soft hum of the city outside, allowed me to process not just the betrayal, but the lessons it had imparted. Age had not dulled me. Experience had sharpened me. I was no longer merely surviving. I was strategizing, planning, and fortifying my life. Then came the unexpected visit from a journalist, requesting an interview for a story about elder financial abuse. Jonathan cautioned me, reminding me of the importance of maintaining legal discretion. I agreed, carefully controlling the narrative, focusing on the lessons learned, the importance of vigilance, and the subtle ways betrayal can manifest even in the closest relationships. I spoke of resilience, patience, and the quiet strength that comes from understanding one's own worth. In the following days, the media attention added a new layer to the unfolding events. Friends and distant relatives reached out, some with support, others with curiosity, and a few with judgment. I listened to all, but I did not engage beyond what felt necessary. My life was no longer dictated by others' assumptions, expectations, or manipulations. It belonged solely to me. By the end of the month, court hearings resumed with new evidence, placing Michael, Rachel, and Laura in increasingly untenable positions. Daniel, who had avoided direct involvement, was encouraged to cooperate fully, which he reluctantly did. The preliminary trials moved slowly, but the direction was unmistakable. The full weight of the law now supported me, and their attempts to manipulate, intimidate, or control had no foundation left to stand upon. During this period, I also began reaching out to others quietly. Friends, acquaintances, and legal professionals, who had experienced similar betrayals. Sharing my story carefully and selectively became a form of empowerment, not just for myself, but for those who had felt powerless. I realized that my experience, painful as it had been, could serve as a guide, a warning, and a source of strength for others navigating the treacherous intersections of family and finance. As the weeks stretched into months, I developed routines that reinforced my independence. Mornings began with walks through the garden, evenings with reading or letters. I cooked meals without oversight, organized rooms without consultation, and celebrated the small victories of autonomy. The silence of the house, once oppressive, became a companion, a quiet affirmation of my regained control. Yet, despite this newfound peace, I remained vigilant. They had underestimated me once. I could not allow them a second opportunity. Each interaction, each message, each email was approached with caution, analyzed, and archived. The past had taught me that betrayal thrives in shadows. I had no intention of giving them that space again. In quiet moments, I reflected on the path that had brought me here. From trusting and nurturing my children, to quietly observing their schemes, to building legal and financial fortifications, I had transformed in ways that were subtle but profound. Age had not made me frail. It had made me resilient. Betrayal had not destroyed me. It had honed me. And every day, I reclaimed pieces of my life, not with anger, but with clarity and resolve. By the time the next court date arrived, the stage was set. Evidence meticulously organized, legal counsel prepared, and personal resolve unshakable. The unfolding of justice was inevitable, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in the quiet accumulation of truth, patience, and unwavering observation. And in that quiet determination, I realized something essential. Survival alone is not the victory. The true triumph is reclaiming your life, your dignity, and your voice after it has been threatened, undermined, and challenged by those you once loved most. The first steps had been taken. The walls of deception were cracking. And I was ready to witness the complete unraveling. The courtroom was alive with a tension I hadn't felt in years. Not the casual tension of a family dispute, but the heavy, deliberate intensity of consequences finally confronting those who had believed themselves untouchable. As I walked through the polished doors, the echo of my footsteps seemed louder than usual, a reminder that every movement was mine to command. Every glance from the public benches, every click of the reporters' cameras, every whispered speculation, added layers to the truth unfolding before them all. I had prepared meticulously for this day, but preparation did not remove the chill of anticipation. Jonathan walked beside me, calm and methodical, his presence a steadying force. "Remember," he said quietly, "they can't intimidate you here. Facts speak louder than words, and we have facts." I nodded. Facts. That was the shield, the sword, and the fortress all at once. Michael, Rachel, Laura, and Daniel arrived separately, escorted by their attorneys. Their faces were masks, some of fear, some of forced confidence, others a fragile attempt at dignity. They avoided my eyes as they were led into the room, but I caught glimpses. A flicker of panic in Michael's gaze, Rachel's lips pressed so tightly they nearly disappeared, Laura's rigid posture betraying the tremor beneath, and Daniel's hesitant, guilt-laden shuffle. I studied them like one might study a storm cloud. Predictable in its patterns, dangerous in its potential, but ultimately contained if approached with care. The judge entered, commanding immediate attention. Every head rose in silent acknowledgement of authority. The hearing began with the presentation of evidence, a meticulously compiled dossier detailing years of manipulation, theft, and conspiracy. Bank statements, forged documents, emails, medical notes, and recorded conversations were presented with precision. Each item was a nail in the coffin of deceit, and the weight of accumulated truth pressed heavily on the defendants. Jonathan handled the opening statements with deliberate clarity. "Your Honor," he began, "this case involves a coordinated effort to exploit an elderly woman, her finances, and her trust. The evidence will show a pattern of manipulation, coercion, and criminal activity executed over several years by those closest to her." The courtroom remained quiet, the gravity settling over every listener. I sat still, observing the reactions, the tightening of jaws, the shifting of weight, the quick, anxious glances between my children. They had never imagined the full scope of my awareness, the depth of preparation, the patience that had guided my every step. When it was my turn to testify, I stood without hesitation. My voice was steady, calm, and unwavering. I described every encounter, every subtle manipulation, every hidden attempt to undermine my autonomy. I spoke of the doctor's warning, the forged power of attorney documents, the secret meetings, and the small deliberate thefts of money that had accumulated over time. I recounted the subtle betrayals that were invisible to the casual observer but devastating in their cumulative effect. Rachel's face turned pale. She could no longer hide behind forced concern or feigned ignorance. Laura's fingers trembled as she clutched her folder, desperately searching for a detail that might shift blame. Michael's eyes narrowed, a calculated attempt to mask his panic, and Daniel avoided eye contact entirely, silently acknowledging his role, however indirect. Every word I spoke was deliberate, a reflection of years spent observing, understanding, and preparing. I did not allow anger to dominate. I did not cry. I spoke in the measured tones of someone who had faced betrayal and refused to be diminished. Facts, I realized, carried a power that emotion often cannot. Evidence of their communications was introduced next. Emails between Michael and Laura discussing asset transfers, Rachel coordinating account manipulations, and messages that exposed their confidence in my assumed compliance. The room reacted as the emails were read aloud. The jury, the judge, Even the gallery absorbed the calculated precision with which my family had executed their plan. During cross-examination, Michael's attorney attempted to paint me as paranoid, emotionally unstable, and influenced unduly by legal counsel. But my preparation was thorough. Each assertion was countered with documented facts, recorded evidence, and the quiet authority of someone who had lived decades understanding the nuances of both human behavior and legal frameworks. Every attempt to undermine me faltered. Rachel's lawyer tried to manipulate the narrative, emphasizing familial love and concern, portraying her actions as protective rather than exploitative. I listened carefully, then presented her own emails and messages, revealing intent that contradicted her claims. The courtroom grew silent as her attempts at justification crumbled under the weight of her own words. Laura's attorney attempted a more sophisticated defense, arguing that documentation errors were accidental and that coordination with her siblings was merely administrative. I allowed the defense to speak fully, then presented her drafts, her edits, and her communications with Michael, showing a deliberate orchestration of plans to misappropriate funds and control my decisions. Daniel's lawyer, faced with overwhelming evidence of indirect complicity, had little choice but to advise full cooperation. His testimony confirmed that he had known of the schemes, had provided access, and had witnessed planning meetings, even if he had not initiated the actions. His partial admission, carefully framed, nonetheless solidified the narrative against all of them. Throughout the hearing, I observed their reactions, noting micro-expressions, shifts in posture, the subtle cracking of composure. Betrayal, when exposed, often leaves physical traces. The tightness in Michael's jaw, Rachel's shallow breathing, Laura's fixed stare, Daniel's hesitant glances, they all told the story I had been preparing to reveal. By late afternoon, the judge requested closing statements. Jonathan's words were precise, compelling, and unyielding. "This case is about more than finances," he said. "It is about trust, autonomy, and the violation of fundamental human rights. The evidence is clear. The defendants, entrusted with care and love, chose exploitation instead. Justice demands accountability." I was asked if I wished to make a personal statement. I stood slowly, my hands steady on the podium. "For decades," I began, "I believed that love and family could never betray me. I was wrong. But I also learned something essential. Even in the face of the most intimate deception, truth, patience, and vigilance can reclaim what is ours. I have spent my life nurturing, and I have spent my later years defending. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Let this be a reminder. Age does not diminish awareness, and loyalty is earned, not assumed." The words hung in the air. The courtroom, silent and attentive, absorbed them fully. No one moved until the judge nodded, signaling the end of the session. My family's faces were etched with disbelief, shame, and the dawning realization that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. Outside the courthouse, I breathed deeply. The air felt lighter, sharper, charged with the sense of an ordeal finally moving toward resolution. Photographers captured images, reporters murmured, and strangers offered congratulations. Yet, none of that mattered nearly as much as the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the evidence, meticulously gathered, and the law, precisely applied, had begun to dismantle the intricate web of deceit my own children had woven. Returning home, I walked through the rooms, noticing every detail, the walls, the furniture, the photographs. I had taken back control, but the experience had left permanent marks. I knew I would never look at my children the same way, nor would I allow complacency to return. The lessons were deep and enduring. Trust must be validated, vigilance is a form of self-respect, and silence can be deadly when dealing with betrayal. That evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the city lights flickering like tiny stars below. I reflected on the months of careful planning, patient observation, and precise execution that had brought me here. The weight of years had sharpened my judgment rather than dulled it. The betrayals had revealed not just weakness in others, but strength in myself. As I looked at the darkened skyline, I realized the next steps would not be easy, but they were mine to take. The final unraveling of deception was underway, and I was ready. I would continue to protect my life, my assets, and my autonomy, ensuring that the actions of those who had once tried to erase me would be met with unwavering accountability. For the first time in decades, I slept without fear. The battle was not yet fully over, but the tide had turned. I had reclaimed my space, my voice, and my power. And with that reclamation came a profound, quiet understanding. Survival is only the beginning. True victory is the reclamation of one's life, dignity, and self-respect. Tomorrow would bring more proceedings, more revelations, and more exposure. But I faced it with a steady heart. The foundation I had laid, built on patience, intelligence, and unwavering attention to detail, was unshakable. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. The war of deception had entered its final stages, and I was prepared to see it through to the absolute end. The final hearing took place on a cold morning, the kind that sharpened the senses and made every breath feel intentional. I arrived early, as I had learned to do during these months. Punctuality had become a form of armor. The courthouse stood solid and unmoving, a symbol of order that contrasted sharply with the chaos my family had tried to create around my life. This time I felt no fear. Inside, the atmosphere was different from before. The whispers were subdued, the energy heavier, as if everyone present understood that this was not merely another legal proceeding, but the closing chapter of something deeply unsettling. My children were already seated when I entered. They looked smaller somehow, diminished not by age but by exposure. The truth had stripped them of their certainty, their entitlement, their confidence. Jonathan leaned toward me. "Today is about final determinations," he said quietly. "Asset control, restitution, and permanent protections." Permanent. That word carried weight. It meant the end of their access to my life in ways they could never again disguise as love. When the judge entered, the courtroom rose as one. The proceedings began with a summary of findings: elder abuse, financial exploitation, conspiracy, and fraud. The words were delivered calmly, clinically, but each one landed with precision. My name followed by phrases like victim of sustained manipulation and systematic coercion felt strange to hear spoken aloud, yet validating in a way I hadn't anticipated. The court reviewed the financial trail one last time. The shell accounts, the unauthorized transfers, the forged signatures, the attempt to place me under guardianship without my consent. Each element was now undeniable, backed by forensic accounting and digital records that told a story my family could no longer rewrite. Michael's attorney requested leniency, citing stress, business pressure, and misguided concern. I watched Michael as this argument unfolded. He did not look at me. His shoulders were slumped, his earlier arrogance replaced by resignation. The man who once spoke over me at family dinners now sat silent, reduced to the consequences of his own calculations. Rachel was next. Her lawyer framed her actions as confusion, poor judgment, and emotional overwhelm. Rachel dabbed at her eyes, a performance I recognized instantly. She had always been good at that. Tears as currency. But the judge interrupted, referencing her emails, her spreadsheets, her messages coordinating account access. The illusion collapsed under scrutiny. Laura's defense attempted a more strategic approach, emphasizing her professional background, suggesting she had merely handled logistics. The judge responded with a precise rebuttal, citing her role in drafting documents designed to strip me of agency. Laura's jaw tightened. For the first time, she seemed to understand that intelligence without ethics is not protection. It is liability. Daniel finally stood and spoke. His voice was quiet, trembling. He admitted what he knew, what he had ignored, and what he had allowed. His confession did not absolve him, but it clarified the hierarchy of betrayal. He had followed where others led, and the court took that into account. Then the rulings began. All financial control over my assets was permanently returned to me. Any attempt by my children to access my accounts, property, or medical authority was prohibited by law. Restitution was ordered. Funds misappropriated would be repaid, assets returned, penalties enforced. Criminal referrals were issued where appropriate. But the most significant ruling was the protective order. My autonomy was legally affirmed. No future attempt to declare me incompetent could proceed without independent evaluation, court oversight, and my explicit participation. The weapon they had tried to use against me was dismantled entirely. I closed my eyes briefly as the judge spoke those words. Not out of exhaustion, but relief. When I was invited to speak one final time, I stood slowly, aware of every movement. My voice carried clearly. "I am 70 years old," I said. "I have lived long enough to understand that love without respect is not love. I raised my children to be strong, capable, and ambitious. I did not raise them to see me as expendable. Today is not about punishment. It is about boundaries. I am reclaiming my life, not just my money, but my dignity, my choices, and my future. No one interrupted. No one looked away. The hearing ended shortly after. The room emptied in stages, people filing out quietly, the gravity lingering. My children left without speaking to me. There were no apologies, no confrontations. That chapter was closed not with shouting, but with silence. Outside, the sky was pale and expansive. I stood on the courthouse steps, letting the cold air fill my lungs. Reporters approached, but Jonathan handled them, shielding me from questions I no longer needed to answer. This story was no longer theirs to shape. In the weeks that followed, my life transformed in ways both subtle and profound. I sold the house that had held so many memories, both tender and painful. Not out of bitterness, but necessity. Walls remember things we try to forget. I moved into a smaller place overlooking a river, filled with light and quiet. I furnished it deliberately, choosing each item myself, reclaiming the pleasure of decision-making. I changed my phone number. I updated my estate plans, not out of fear, but clarity. Trusts were restructured. Beneficiaries reconsidered. New safeguards implemented. Everything transparent, everything intentional. I also began doing something unexpected. I made friends. Not acquaintances, not obligatory social ties, but genuine connections. People who knew me as I was now, not as a role I once filled. A retired professor who shared my love of history. A neighbor who walked her dog every morning and always stopped to talk. A woman from a legal advocacy group who invited me to speak about elder financial abuse. Yes, I spoke. At first my voice shook. Then it steadied. Then it strengthened. I realized that my experience, painful as it was, could become something useful. Each time someone approached me afterward, eyes bright with recognition or gratitude, I felt a piece of the past loosen its grip. I traveled. Nothing extravagant. Coastal towns, quiet cities, places where I could walk without urgency. I learned to sit with myself without guilt, without apology. I learned that peace is not something granted by others. It is something we allow ourselves to claim. Occasionally, I thought of my children. Not with anger. Not even with sadness most days. More with a distant curiosity, like recalling a book I once read and closed. They made choices. I made mine. The law addressed the rest. One afternoon, as I sat by the river watching the water move steadily forward, I realized something that surprised me. I was happy. Not euphoric. Not dramatically transformed. But content in a way I hadn't been for decades. The constant background noise of obligation, worry, and self-doubt had faded. In its place was something quieter and stronger. Agency. I understood now that aging does not mean fading. It means refining. Stripping away what no longer serves us. Claiming space unapologetically. Protecting what remains with wisdom earned the hard way. At 70, I had not reached the end of my story. I had reached the part where I finally got to write it myself.